We're back for your ears only. I'm David Alpern with another quote from last week's news. That's when the rubber is going to meet the road. That was a senior Defense Department official on the extreme difficulty of forcing ISIS out of Iraqi cities, where air and artillery bombardment hold a high risk of civilian casualties that could also reinforce ISIS' appeal. Despite repeated promises by President Obama not to send in U.S. combat troops, the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman testified they may be necessary. Now, a best segment from our May 28, 1989 Newsweek On Air show with co-host Warren Levinson of AP.
Opening theme music from the movie version of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, a 1960s novel that introduced the world to author John le Carre, instantly acclaimed as a master of Cold War espionage and Cold War contradictions, patriotic double-crosses, ambiguous loyalties, divided souls.
There followed a string of le Carre bestsellers, including Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, The Honorable Schoolboy, Smiley's People, The Little Drummer Girl, and more autobiographical, The Perfect Spy.
This week, the latest le Carre hits the bookstalls with a difference. The Russia House is his first novel of espionage in the era of glasnost, when new stirrings of freedom and dissent inside the Soviet system mean new levels of unpredictability on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It is also the first book le Carre has been able to research by actually visiting the Soviet Union.
From Russia with Love, it might have been called, if that title hadn't already been taken. John le Carre is the subject of this week's cover story in Newsweek. To talk about the Russia House, glasnost, espionage, and himself, we're pleased to have John le Carre, real name David Cornwell. Welcome to Newsweek On Air. I was surprised to learn that you hadn't been to Russia before, though it's understandable given your admissions to Newsweek and others that you had actually worked in British intelligence under Foreign Service cover. What made you decide to go after all these years?
Well, I thought it was time, in the most simple historical sense. I was quite certain that to be in Russia at the moment was to be present at an extraordinary period of our history. It was going to be as exciting as, so to speak, as standing in Berlin and watching the Reichstag burn, only this time the Reichstag was being restored and things were looking more positive.
Was their decision to let you in itself a sign of glasnost?
I think it was. It wasn't easily made. I applied first to the Soviet embassy in London and received no answer at all to my letter to the cultural attaché. And then I went through the ambassador, our ambassador in Moscow, and all of a sudden the walls came down and I got an invitation from the Union of Writers.
How did the Russia you saw compare with the Russia you've written about in such dark detail for so many years?
Well, perceived from outside during the Cold War, the Soviet Union looked like a dark castle, and I think I described it that way. And I described indeed both camps as groaning under the weight of the Cold War and the misery of ideological complexity and, on the Soviet side, enslavement to a system that wasn't working. Most particularly, I suppose, I thought of the Soviet Union as monolithic, as a centrally organized outfit, because of its repressive capacities and its repressive effect upon its population. By the time I got there, it was so clearly disintegrating that monolith could no longer be found.
You were offered the chance to meet British traitor Kim Philby, a rough model for some of the Soviet moles in your fictional British Secret Services, but you refused. Why?
Well, I felt it inelegant to be the guest of the ambassador one night, that is, of the Queen's representative, and the guest of the Queen's biggest traitor the next night. And so if it was an invitation to meet Kim Philby, I was quite pleased to pass it up. I also don't think that I could have sat with Philby indefinitely without losing my temper. One does have to remember that he was a killer. He was, by my perception at least, a man of natural and persistent deceit. I thought he was a hateful man, always.
The Russia House will be published in the Soviet Union, but others of your books have not. Though I understand you have quite a following among an underground following among the computer set.
Yes,
what do you know about that?
That was very touching when I got there to discover that students, for example, at the State University had apparently run up my books in English on a word processor and stood round it in groups and watched the pages being turned. So I was very moved by that.
It's computer samizdat.
That's right, computer samizdat, exactly.
What is there about espionage that makes it such an effective and affecting setting for serious contemporary novels such as yours?
Well, it's all around us, that's the first thing. I think all of us know that to a great extent, the version we are given of political events is not the reality. When all of a sudden we get a scandal like Irangate, we have held up to us to inspect the other, perhaps 9/10 of political life. So espionage enables us to interpret our perceptions in terms of conspiracy. That's one thing. But I think beyond that, the condition of the spy is one in which, to some extent, we all live, whether in relations to the institutions we work for, the firms, the corporations we work for, within marriage, outside marriage. All of us have secret lives that we're aware of. We often think we're the only people who live them, but in fact, most of us, to one extent or another, share those secret lives. And so perhaps the universality of my stuff in some way speaks to the unexpressed part of us.
I wonder if what we've been exposed to in real-life spying over the last few years, attempts on Fidel Castro's life, etc., make it harder or easier to write spy fiction.
I think that it certainly, in my case, it was always necessary to pull back from the reality in order to make one's stories credible. I mean, if you take, for example, the Watergate affair, if I'd set out to write a story about a president who bugged himself by mistake, I would have been ridiculed. And so it goes in the espionage business. If I'd written a story about flying cakes to Tehran, really people would have said Le Carre's lost his marbles. So I really have to find a much more modest context for my stuff.
Do you think that Glasnost and a new era of good feeling, to the extent that they last, will make it harder for the East-West spy novel and the real-life self-serving intelligence bureaucracies of both sides?
I think the fun will be for those who write in the genre to break the pieces up, to listen and watch history in the making, and to readjust to whatever comes along in the future. I think what one must bear in mind is that the prospect of peace breaking out in no way suggests that espionage will be run down as an industry. Quite the reverse. If your former enemy is breaking into pieces and you don't know which way the pieces are going to jump, you must spy the living daylights out of him. What I do know is that I'm thrilled to face the future of perestroika and look for other theaters and other political situations to write about. I'm very glad to be given a whole new deck of cards.
I must say, the only thing better than reading your books is hearing you read them. I gather you just won one of the books that you've read on tape has just won a prize for that, and I don't think anybody does your work and all of the voices as well as you do.
Well, thank you very much. I can do bird noises, too, but I won't do them now.
David Cornwell, better known as John le Carre, author of The Russia House, just going on sale, and the subject of this week's cover story in Newsweek. Thanks again. Forget we ever talked.
From our May 28, 1989 Newsweek on Air program, now a quote on the new face of war from last week's news. "We will never obey or bend to the aggressor." That was Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko seeking additional support from a joint session of the U.S. Congress to counter continued Russian subversion and incursion in border areas controlled by pro-Moscow separatists, even as the West escalated economic sanctions. Next, a Reagan rebuttal. Nancy's for your ears only.